If you want, you can listen. Suzanne's talking a little bit about the violin. We'll see if it's on that or not, but I don't know what she's calling back like that.
What's that? Oh.
Or do you want to start now?
Yeah, let's start now. So we tried on the live stream, we tried to.
Oh, do you, oh, okay. So you're going to start.
And then she'll play, so it's not boring.
Okay, so are you going to? Yeah. Okay, I'll introduce you and then we'll start. Okay, this one or like sure this. Good evening. Welcome to all of our parishioners. Welcome to our guests. We're so excited to have Violins for Hope this evening. I'm Father Gil Martinez, and we're speaking to our people who are watching on live stream. So we have quite a number of people watching on the screen. So welcome to St. Paul the Apostle Catholic Community for this really special evening. I'm going to ask Jeffrey Paroli, Dr. Jeffrey Paroli, who's our director of music, who made the arrangements for this program, to offer a fuller introduction. So welcome.
Thank you, Father, and hello, everybody. Welcome. For several of you, welcome back. Saw you at Mass. This is a wonderful and special evening, and I really appreciate you coming out here and joining us for this very, very special evening, talking about music and history in a very real and tangible way. Tonight we have Suzanne Reto, who's over here, who will be speaking on behalf of the organization called Violins of Hope, which is an organization dedicated to preserving violins that were played in concentration camps during the Holocaust and have survived. And you'll hear the stories of some of those instruments tonight. You will also hear a performance on these instruments by our friend Sandra. Can you remember what your last name is? Zaninovich, Sandra Zaninovich, who will be playing the violin tonight for us as well. And she is playing on a surviving instrument as well. So it'll be a beautiful and meaningful evening, and thank you again for joining us. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Suzanne Reto up.
Thank you so much, and thank you for those of you who are here in person, and equally thanking you, all of you who are at home watching and listening. This is a very moving evening in many ways, because you've probably heard that in Texas there's a synagogue where there are 4 hostages, and being in a house of worship, let's hope by the end of the evening, when we are done, things will be better. One hostage was released a couple of hours ago, but who knows, when somebody's a hater and has a mission, who knows what he is able or willing to do. But I would very much love to tell you about Violins of Hope, which has been a project, believe it or not, I've been working on a little over 4 years. And the 4 years, of course, includes the 1.5 year of COVID postponement. But it's been a labor of love. Both my husband and I are survivors. I'm probably one of the younger ones because I was born during the Holocaust. My husband's a few years older and he was a little boy, but I actually was born 6 days before the invasion of Hungary. As you know, Hungary was the last country to be invaded in 1944, March 19th, and I was born on the 13th. So for me, this project is a very personal project and very important, because as long as our schools don't teach our youngsters our history, and it is not ancient history, it's history of our lifetime, we need to do a better job. And when my first book came out, telling the story of the Holocaust and then growing up in communism, people used to say, oh, come on. But really and truly, I have been on this mission of educating youngsters since the early 2000s, and now with Violins of Hope, it's kind of a culmination. And what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about Violins of Hope, then have Sandra play for us, and then I'll come back and tell a little bit more. And if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt whenever you have a question, and I'll be very glad to answer. But Violins of Hope is an amazing project started by a father and his son, Amnon Weinstein, in Tel Aviv, whose parents left Poland in 1938 and settled in Palestine. The father, actually, one of the violins was the grandfather's violin, and when he decided to go to Palestine, they realized that there are lots and lots of musicians, and they'll be able to hopefully establish a business and make a livelihood. They did, and they had this business of creating, repairing, and doing all kinds of things to violins. At the end of the war, after the Holocaust, there were many, many European Jews who were fortunately able to survive, went to Palestine. At that point, though, they no longer wanted to play on their instruments because most of the instruments were made in Germany. And as you know, most people didn't want to use anything German, didn't want to play on German instruments. They took it into him and said, I want to sell it, I want to give it. And one person said, I want to burn it if you don't want it. And when he said that, Amnon Weinstein said, you can't do that. You can't do that to an instrument. So he kept collecting. Everybody who brought it into him, he kept it. But he did nothing with it for many, many years. You probably are aware that anytime we go through difficult times, the wounds are very raw and very difficult, and it's hard to handle, hard to be able to cope with the difficulties, just the psychological influence. So he didn't touch these instruments for many, many years. They were hanging in his workshop, around 400 instruments hanging. And finally, in the early 1990s, he had the emotional and psychological strength to say to himself, I think it's time I did something with it. At the same time, he was invited to go to Germany, and someone had suggested that you do need to do something with it and make more value out of these treasured instruments. So in the middle 1990s, he came up with this incredible project called Violins of Hope. And what he was hoping is that violins from all over the world will be able to play and be used as teaching instruments, and also to create the culture that many of these people enjoyed and left behind. So the project was founded, and since then, it's been in many, many cities around the world, but especially in the United States, and we have it in many different cities. It is almost over in Los Angeles, and believe it or not, tonight would have been the last concert, but a couple of the concerts this week had been canceled. Unfortunately, COVID has not done great things for us, and it got in the way, but we're here to enjoy it no matter what. And the important thing to learn from it is that these violins were beaten, battered, some of them burned, and with the restoration, they're brought back to life. And they represent us survivors. And like Amnon Weinstein said, they are survivors themselves. And this is the ultimate victory. The Nazis are gone, and we are here, and we're here to tell the story. And the violins will remain our storytellers because they'll be here for many years longer than we are. So the instruments are representative of a culture, of an era, and it also symbolizes the ability to overcome atrocities and the ability to go on, learn from it. Like my parents always said, don't let the bad weaken you, let it be a strengthener. And this is how I've learned to live my life, and I think the violins represent me as well as the Jewish people. And I would like to make a very important statement. While the Violins of Hope project was founded on horrific evil acts perpetrated on Jewish people and founded on Jewish experiences, in today's world, this is a universal project. This is for all mankind and for humanity everywhere. So we need to work together to make sure that our children and grandchildren know the story, because sadly, the schools are not doing a great job. Even if they have a little bit of history, some of it is fabricated, but they definitely don't have musical enrichment. So it's a sad situation, and we as parents and grandparents have to do an even better job just to make up for what is not being done for them. And to tell you that music is so important, I would like to invite Sandra to play for you, and then I'll come back and tell a little bit more and tell you how I came to this project and why it is so dear to my heart. Thank you.
I want to say the most ginormous thank you in the whole world to Suzanne Rato, who is the sponsor of these violins. It's because of her that they are here in the United States, and without her intervention, they never would have been here. For me, it is one of the greatest privileges and honors of my life to be able to make these violins speak again. The ones that the Nazis had thought that they had silenced forever when they silenced their owners, well, they didn't. And the Nazis are gone, but the violins are here. And they're right here thanks to Suzanne. So thank you, thank you.
Sandra will be back with more. You might be wondering how I came to do this project, because this is, as I said, a very long, involved project. And when I first started 4.5 years ago, and the son of the founder of Violins of Hope is the one who's handling it, because the dad is getting a little older, and the young man is handling all the works and traveling with the instruments. And when we first connected, he said, well, how about 2 years from now? I said, 2 years? What would need 2 years? He says, well, you will need it. And it's true, the planning and organizing and all of that does take time. And by the way, I got so emotional when I came up on stage. I want to thank Father and Jeffrey for having this evening tonight to be able to introduce the Violins of Hope to another part of our community. So thank you. So Violins of Hope was introduced to me by a friend, and she said, would you like to do it? And I thought, this is just what the doctor ordered, because I have been an outspoken person about history and wanting to teach youngsters, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get through to them, and teaching history and Holocaust history is not a rosy subject. And what better way than through music, and Violins of Hope sounded like the perfect opportunity. Immediately I contacted them when she told me about it, and you know, today with the communication being how wonderful it is, it didn't take more than a few hours, and within a couple of days we had everything set up, and then all I had to do was to get to work and organize the programs throughout the community. The important thing is to get it through to youngsters, but at the same time, it's a three-pronged program. Culturally speaking, having concerts, we had major concerts, beautiful orchestral events, and then education, which is really my aim, because without furthering the education and the knowledge of youngsters, where will we be? And the third part was, up till last Sunday, there was an exhibit at the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum in Pan Pacific Park where several of the instruments were displayed and a little bit of history about each one of them. The instruments are rather a unique collection. The classical instruments have been played in concentration camps and ghettos and different places, and some of them, even though they may not have been played in the concentration camps, they should be considered Holocaust instruments because the instrument either survived and came across the ocean with the person, or it went through hardships, and perhaps the opportunity to play was a way for people to survive. Many of the people who played in the concentration camps, music was a way and an opportunity to survive for various reasons, one of which was the Nazis were incredible music lovers, so much so that they even made these hard and harsh life living prisoners create music, including dance music. If you can imagine the oxymoronic idea of having dance music in a concentration camp, or the other more evil than I can imagine, when they arrived at the camps from these cattle cars, many of them, you're probably aware, they were going through a selection process. One line was for the workers, the ones who were strong enough to support the needs of the Nazis, and the other line was the weaker, older, and many children. And believe it or not, the Nazis were so calculated and so evil. The ones that were not good enough to be workers, and I call them slaves, they didn't even get tattooed because they didn't want to waste the ink on them. Because moments after arrival, they were marched to the gas chamber to their death, accompanied by music. it just, you know, the deceit of music being such a beautiful part of our lives and marching to the gas chamber to music was really, when you visualize it, it's hard to fathom that they can be as evil as they were, but they were. So this was one way for the people who were able to play music. They were privileged, and being privileged in the camp was an incredible opportunity to possibly survive. One, they were able to survive because they had more privileges, more food given to them, and for others, it was a way to postpone the reality and extend their lives. If these musicians did not have to share in the food that was doled out to the group, the few who were left behind had a bigger share, and maybe that morsel or two allowed them to postpone the reality and extend their lives. So music was a major, major part of saving or prolonging life. These musicians were amazing people, and the ability to hope and really endure all the terrible things. And I will tell you one story, which is very hard for me to tell, even though I must have told it many, many times. The story of a musician who lived the rest of his life in Cincinnati for 40 years as one of the leading teachers. He and his brother arrived in Auschwitz, and the brother became sick, and he never saw the brother again. And then he became ill, and because he was a musician, instead of throwing him in a gas chamber, the Nazis put him in a hospital. And when he got there lying in his bed, wondering whether he'll come out alive or not, a doctor walked in and started to talk to him. And he said, "What did you do when you weren't here?" And he said, "I'm a musician." And this doctor told him that he attended a concert several years ago in Breslau, which is near Dresden in Germany. And this was the most moving evening of his life. And believe it or not, he remembered the pieces of music that was played. And Henry, the musician prisoner, said, "And that was me playing it." Well, that's all the doctor needed to hear, and he wanted to make sure he saves him. He said, "Wait a minute, I'll be back in a few minutes." He left. A few minutes later came back with a corpse on his shoulder and some papers, and he told Henry to move over. He placed the corpse in the bed and put Henry on his shoulder and took him out. This is how Henry saved his life, and thanks to this amazing doctor. So you know that music saves lives. This is a perfect example of how amazing it can be, and that's why music is such an important part of our lives, and we need to implore upon our kids to have that enrichment within them. So this is just a little story to illustrate the importance of music and how important the Violins of Hope play a role in everything today, telling people what happened. So I was telling you about the stories of the violins. Some of the violins came from having been played in the camps and in different parts of Europe. And there was also another group of players, and a couple of the instruments you will be able to see. They have the beautiful Star of David on the back of them. They represent a Klezmer culture in Russia and Poland, which was also silenced during World War II. These were like folk music instruments. Every family had them in their homes, and they were playing almost like the American jazz. It was very much improvised music, and it was an amazing culture. During the war, thank you. By the way, this is my husband, Robert, who's my great assistant. And the prompter, because if I forget something, he makes sure he tells me what I did. So this is just one of the beautiful instruments. And if you notice, the edge is beautiful, decorated with mother of pearl. And the back of it is this beautiful Star of David, which is the representative of the Klezmer culture. And you're probably aware that Klezmer is almost synonymous with Fiddler on the Roof. It's very upbeat, very happy, and this is what was enjoying a revival in the 70s here, and we're enjoying it because I'm sure you've seen Fiddler on the Roof in some form or another, and just recently a film came out about how it was made, and supposedly since the 60s, when Fiddler was first produced, it has been shown every day of the year in some country or another. It's an amazing story because it pleases everybody. It's happy, joyous music. And at least we have the pleasure of having that as remembering how things went in those days. It's amazing to remember that even in the most difficult times, music played a major role in families or people, and here we are, 80 years later, we're talking about it, so you know it's an important part of our lives. And 80 years, and it'll be around hopefully for many more 80 years to come. So the instruments were part of the collection, and there are mostly violins. By now there are about 90 instruments that have been restored. 50 or 60 travel at a time, but there's one viola and one cello. And you can probably imagine a cello is not one instrument that you can just pick up and go with. And you may wonder why so many violins. Violin is portable. When the prisoners were picked up, all they could do is just put it under their arm and travel with it. And for many of them, it was part of their lives. It was almost an extension of their bodies. So the cello is a very precious instrument because I wonder if any of you have heard of the movie Orchestra of Exiles. Orchestra of Exiles is an amazing movie created from the effort and the accomplishment of the Polish violinist Bronislaw Huberman, who in 1935 and early 1936 gave up his own flourishing violin career in order to save the Jewish musicians of Europe. As you probably know, that after Hitler came in and the Nuremberg laws were enacted, all the Jewish musicians were kicked out of their orchestras. So they were out of jobs, and they were all dying to find a way to get back into working. And this Bronislaw Huberman decided to do his cultural as well as his rescue mission by creating an orchestra, which at that time was called the Palestine Symphony. This was an amazing accomplishment because it was very, very difficult to get people visas. And with the British mandate, there were immigration laws. Immigration is all the time. In those days, like today. And he decided to found this incredible orchestra. He had great, great opportunity because all the finest musicians from Europe he was able to choose. As a matter of fact, when the orchestra was founded, every seat in the orchestra was played by the first player in the original orchestra where these people played. The first violinist, the first this, and the first that. And in 1936, on day after Christmas, Toscanini came to Palestine and conducted the very first concert. So this was the birth of the Palestine Symphony, which after the birth of Israel became the Israel Philharmonic, And as you know, it's one of the finest orchestras in the world today. So there's big history. And the story of the cello is that the cello was played by the first cellist in the Palestine Symphony until his death. And after he died, his family donated the instrument to the Violins of Hope collection. So even though that instrument did not necessarily play in the camps, it was very much part of a Holocaust history, and you can call it a Holocaust instrument. And since we've been talking too much, I would like to ask Sandra back to play a little bit of fiddler for an upbeat little interlude, and then I'll come back and finish up, and if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer. Sandra mentioned this was the unofficial anthem of Israel after the war of 1967, and before we end the evening, she will play the actual anthem, Hatikva, which means the hope, and we live with hope every day. And before I forget, I would like to make sure if you're interested in watching the film Orchestra of Exiles, it's on, I think, Netflix or Prime, and you'll be able to see it. It is well worth it. It's just an amazing story. And as part of the Violins of Hope project that I was doing, one of the evenings I had the film showing, and then afterwards we talked about the whole film and its creation by the writer, producer, and director of the film. And if any of you would like to go on the website of Violins of Hope, losangeles.org, you will be able to see all the different programs that we had in the last 5 weeks and all the different things that we had in the past year, because in order to keep a flame afloat, I wanted to have programs to keep the interest alive, and had many different things during the year, including my speaking to youngsters through the Holocaust Museum, because as I said, education is my aim, because with that we can at least help to create a better, less hateful world for our future. And the kids find it by talking to them through music, showing them instruments and showing and telling them the stories of the instruments and their survival rather than dry textbook stories. Hopefully it resonates better with them. And at this point, I wonder if you have any questions. I can tell you stories, and there's one story my husband will not let me leave any place. I have to tell that, but I would love to know if you have any questions about anything. The books that you have a story about what's happened in the last few weeks, as well as little stories about the instruments, several of the instruments, not all of them, of course, and it'll give you an insight into the project and the extent of what it is all about. Anybody, any questions? Yes. They are not in the Stradivarius class, but as we all know, instruments are not always necessarily the best just because they're an Amati or a Guarneri and Stradivarius. They are brought back to life by Amnon Weinstein to world-class playing. So the instrument, and every instrument is different, and it plays in a different person's hand. So the worst instrument in a great player can produce wonderful sounds, and so the instruments do play well. As a matter of fact, someone recently told me, if anybody wants to buy a Steinway piano and you want to go into a store and figure out which one you like, you better buy the one that you like and you listen to, because being handmade, every one of them sound different. And if you think you picked the right one, it may not be the right one if you take a different one home. So I would like to tell you, not necessarily a direct Holocaust story, but a Holocaust era story. Friends of ours were at a wedding in Houston several years ago, and they were all sitting at an out-of-towner stable, 10 people from different parts of the country. And a man and a woman struck up a conversation and said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Lodz, Poland." And he said, "Me too." And asked another question, "Where did you go?" "I was taken to Auschwitz." "Me too." "What date?" And everything he asked, the answer was "me too." It was almost like a duplicate of her life. After a few questions, he got very exasperated, and finally he said, "And what was your number?" Because, you know, they gave the tattoo as they arrived. She pulls up her sleeve and shows him the number, and he says, "That's my wife's number." They were husband and wife before the war. They never saw one another after. And she said, "Well, we waited for you, you didn't come back." He said, "We waited for you, you didn't show up." Well, you know, it could have happened 5 minutes apart. They could have been in the same place, but not at the same time. And as I told this story to a synagogue in Westwood, actually, a few months ago, a woman came up and she said, "You know, that story you told really resonated with me because my parents were also taken. They were married before the war. They were taken, and when they returned, they didn't meet. Then months later, they were walking on the street of Moldova, and serendipitously, they bumped into one another." And she said, "And I'm the product of that reunion." So these stories, and everybody has different stories similar to this. These are just a couple of the amazing stories that are around, and they just inspire us to be able to overcome whatever adversity we're dealt and make sure that we teach our kids to be better people and to teach them, because supposedly, according to the experts, and I don't know who those experts are necessarily, but according to them, lessons of the Holocaust are the greatest way to combat hatred, bigotry, and rising anti-Semitism. Perhaps because it's something that happened in our lifetime, perhaps it's something that was created by a man, and it's a way to teach whatever we can teach our kids, especially when we live in a day like these days and like today of all days, when a hater goes into a synagogue and stops worship services. And it's just, you know, every day there is something. So the strength of Violins of Hope lives with us, and it's a symbol of the ability to overcome. And I hope all of you enjoyed a little bit of introduction to this part of our history. And with that, I would love Sandra to play really the anthem of Israel, which really stands for the hope. Hatikva means the hope. Thank you.
To play the anthem of Israel on an instrument from the Holocaust is a feeling unlike anything I can ever express in words. I'm just so grateful to have this privilege.
Thank you to Suzanne, and thank you to Sandra for this beautiful evening that you presented for us. The violins are on display over here on top of the piano. You are welcome to come look at them and actually touch them as long as you're careful. But yes, they're available here for your viewing. And thank you for all for coming out tonight, and thank you again.